To demonstrate the very last annotation, InverseProperty, I've created a new class in my domain, person. And I also want to point out that I created a DB set. If I didn't do this, I'm not going to get a new table in my database. The database creation depends very much on what the context is exposing. In my domain, a person can either be an administrator of a particular Twitter alias or Twitter account, or they can be a guest author. So I've got two properties in here that both refer back to alias. One is alias administrator and the other is alias guest author. Now, by default, when I ran this, CodeFirst recognized that for those two properties, I'm going to need foreign keys, one for each of them, that they're different. So it created one called alias administrator, right after the property, and then underscore author key, which is the entity key that we know. And the second foreign key is called alias guest author, author key. So that works out great. What if, however, I decide that not only do I want to be able to reference those aliases from the person class, but in the Twitter alias class, I also want to see who are my administrators and who are my guest authors. So I'll pop those properties in there. These are both list of person. One is listing admins and the other is listing guest authors. So now I have a bidirectional navigation between those two classes. So if I run this again and the database gets regenerated, I go back to the people table. CodeFirst was all kinds of confused. It saw that in the person class, I have two references back to alias, and it saw in the alias class that I have two references over to people. It didn't understand that those were bidirectional relationships, so it actually gave me 4 foreign keys. And here's where I can use InverseProperty. And InverseProperty is designed for when you have multiple relationships between entities and you need to sort this problem out so that it understands how the foreign keys align. So I'll go back to my classes. So back in my classes, what I can do is I can use the inverse property to say which property in that related class lines up with this property. So I'll use inverse property, and then this one, the admins, relates to the property called alias administrator. And this one relates to guest authors. So I'll run this again and have CodeFirst recreate the database. And now you can see that thanks to the inverse property, CodeFirst was able to figure out that we really only needed 2 foreign keys there, not all 4. So now as I'm coding and I'm working with those lists of people or referring from the people back to the alias, the classes understand those relationships. And then when it's time for Entity Framework to build up the store commands, whether it's the queries or commands to push data back into the database, it will have a very clear understanding of how those classes map to the database and back again.